Good afternoon. Yes, it is afternoon. 12:30 on the 17th, Friday the 17th. And welcome to The Road to Recovery, The Road to Freedom with Mark. This is my 28-minute show every Friday. And I wasn't due to be here. I was supposed to go and see some good friends up north and enjoy a game of rugby since we're finally free of that terrible plague. But unfortunately, my poor old mum is about to peg it, so you got to do the right thing, hang around. So here's hoping it goes quickly, smoothly, and fairly painlessly. I hope so. And I'd like to acknowledge family today. You may not always get along with them, but I hope you never give up on them. It's surprising how time can heal rifts between people, and at the end of the day, all you've got is your friends and family. You don't have much else in this life. Everything else tends to be quite transitory. It comes and goes rather swiftly, and not many friends stick by you, in times of trouble. A lot of what I call acquaintances, as opposed to friends, quickly drop away, disappear. And I'm a terrible one for keeping in touch with friends. For whatever reason, we part company and don't see each other again, sometimes for a long time, sometimes I never see them again in my life. And there's been so many thousands of good people came in and out of my life and influenced me in many ways, some of which I don't even fully understand to this day. And I guess that's what makes life so very interesting. When you reach out and try something different, you meet characters you never thought you would. And I was lucky enough to meet Michael and Veronica down here at Arrow Radio, and they offered me quite some years ago now the opportunity to do a show. And I grabbed the chance. Excuse me. And the reason for that is that, it's unusual to be given a voice when you're in a situation like mine, when you're on a benefit, suffering from mental health issues. Generally, you tend to be lost in the background and unimportant as far as society is concerned. And the beauty of things like Wairarapa TV and Arrow Radio, a community radio station, is that they give people a voice, people who would otherwise not have that opportunity. And whilst I realise that at times my show could be considered abrasive, even offensive, it is a point of view that is nonetheless relevant. Just because it is not politically correct doesn't make it wrong. In fact, often political correctness is just a matter of one stupid chicken following another down a blind path. And I like to think that I bring to this show and to society a unique perspective, someone who has walked the mile rather than just empathising on how it must be for you poor people. I have suffered a lot over the decades. More than most, that's for sure. And I've come within a whisper of death so many times I could write a whole book about that alone. And today's story is one of those times where I came very, very close to dying and should not have made it out alive. And every time that happens to me, it makes me look at my life, reassess what I've done, where I am and where I'm going, and it helps me to see through new eyes. And I guess, if we don't learn from our mistakes, then we don't learn at all. Suffering and misfortune and bad decisions are the things that teach us sometimes the best lessons of all. If nothing else, not to do that stupid thing again, but perhaps opening our eyes to see that perhaps there is a better way, a new path, a new opportunity, and it can be surprising what can offer itself from the rubble of devastation which is what your life becomes when you fall off the edge, when you're mentally unwell, when you end up locked in a room suffering on your own, and nobody knows and nobody cares, and you either make it or you don't at that point, and some don't. So if I can do my bit to help people, to say, hey, look, I've suffered too, and this is what I do, and this is how I find peace, then perhaps, I don't know if I can save anyone, but perhaps I can help some people. And that's what the show is really all about, is to help people, if I can, through allowing them to understand that there are ways out of situations. There is always a way out. There is always an opportunity. There is always a reason to live. And it may not necessarily be an epiphany on the road to Damascus, some blinding light that knocks you off the back of a horse. Sometimes change comes incrementally, a step at a time. It's how it happens most of the time, and it certainly did for me. And one of the things that has happened to me over the last sort of 15, 20 years is that I've learned to pay more attention to detail and gain joy out of the simplest things in life. I often go for a walk down by the river as often as I can, whenever there's a little bit of sun to be had. And I go and watch these tuis in the gum tree. There's a whole load of them. It's my special little spot that I go to. And I really feel my heart lift, and I forget my worries just for a little while I watch the river flow and the birds and the fish. And I found over the years that helps to heal my pain, my soul. I often go for walks on rugged beaches for miles if I can, and the sound of the waves, getting away from the craziness of cities and people and worries and stresses and pressures and demands, and just clearing your head. You know, we live in such a busy world, and there are all kinds of stresses and strains pulling us in every direction, and often it can get on top of you. And your natural instinct when you're mentally unwell is to lock yourself away. And the cure, or one of them at least, is to get out. To get out of that, to break out, because what you are doing is forming a prison around yourself. A prison of security and assuredness, sitting there drinking coffee all day, reading a book. It's a good thing to do for a little while, but if that is all you are doing and you are simply existing, seeing out the days without any joy or plan or hope, then you need to open that door and step outside. Sometimes even a walk in the rain, if you can get home and have a nice hot shower and sit by the heater, it can be quite refreshing. But I understand when you're on the rock and roll, you don't always have the money for heating and showers. I know what it is to live below the poverty line, and thanks to my family, things have come right a lot better over the last few years than the many, many years that I suffered alone. And I really couldn't have got through it without my friends. I literally owe them my life. The care that they showed me, the kindness when I wasn't always the kindest of persons, when I was argumentative and difficult, and that's the way people are. And if you're dealing with someone who's suffering from mental health, sometimes you've got to overlook the shortness and the angriness and realise a lot of that is born of frustration. So patience is the key. And I remember this lady, Aruna Patel, the psychiatrist, telling me that it takes as long as it takes. So it's important not to pressurise yourself, but to be gentle with yourself, be patient, and take your time, and think about your successes, enjoy them and revel in them. Okay, well, time is ticking along, and I hate cutting a story short and having to jump a page or two. I do it occasionally, and I feel terrible when I do, because it doesn't really do justice to my story. So I'll give myself plenty of time today. This is a tough one for me because a lot of my stories are about failure. They're interesting and sometimes a little harrowing. But what it proves, beyond all doubt, is even if you do suffer from mental health, even mental health problems, even if you do suffer from depression and obsessive compulsive disorder and bipolar, you can still have a life. You can still do things. Great people. People like Jimi Hendrix, Winston Churchill. I mean, they suffered badly from depression. Hendrix even wrote a song called Manic Depression. He talked about sometimes feeling like he lived at the bottom of a grave. I don't live today, and yet he produced some of the most amazing, most beautiful music I have ever heard in my life. Winston Churchill was one of the greatest orators of the last century, and indeed pulled his country through in their times of greatest need, and is remembered as a hero, which he wasn't necessarily so, but cometh a moment, cometh a man, and despite his depression he was able to achieve great things and be remembered as a great man. I'll never reach those heights, but I'd like to think that my stories will live on beyond me, and maybe someday someone will pick up one of these stories and have a read and say, wow, and get a buzz out of it. And that would be a wonderful thing to leave behind, some kind of legacy. This is part of it. This is called The Longest March Home. It was winter in London, and Christmas was closing in fast. Working on the building sites was dwindling off, and I was missing home. I was slowly coming round to the idea that I would never leave London, and she was to become my new home. But I didn't know anyone in London too well, other than my best mate Seedy, and he was off to Germany to see an old mate Manfred in Mannheim, and then off home. I was freezing my arse off in a big old squat in South London, just off the Old Kent Road. So I went for a final pint with Seedy down the Thomas A. Becket before he headed off for Germany. I loved those pubs down the Old Kent Road, the Henry Cooper, the Green Man, the Thomas A. Becket, the Gin Palace, the Elephant and Castle. But the Thomas A. Becket was my favourite in London. Many of them had gymnasiums and rings for professional boxers upstairs, and they produced some real class boxers, right up to international level. I got to know a few of the boxers who worked as bouncers for a bit of extra cash. They were mighty hard men, but real good fellas, and I watched a few of them fight for titles at places like Crystal Palace. Whilst I was having our last few ales, Seedy suggested I go to Manfred's in Germany to have Christmas with them all. We chewed the fat for a while because it was just a couple of weeks till Christmas. I also didn't have too much spare cash or accommodation in Mannheim. Seedy talked me into it, assuring me we'd have a great time, something to remember. How right he was. Seedy headed off before me, so I had to organise my own way over in a hurry. I didn't have any maps or much in the way of clothes or cash, but what the hell. I booked a trip on the bus from London to Dover, then a ferry to Calais, France, then a bus on to Frankfurt. From there it was a short tram ride out to Mannheim. I rang Manfred and told him I'd be at the train station at 3 p.m. on Wednesday before Christmas, but ended up heading off a day earlier than I had planned. On the way to Dover on the bus, I met a guy from Heidelberg who offered to let me stay at his folks' place. So we sailed over the English Channel and ended up that night in Heidelberg. I spent a wonderful, if somewhat cold and snow-covered day there. The chap's grandmother took a dislike to me and insisted I leave the next day. Some of those Germans were strange, but I was happy enough to finally meet my old friend Manfred on the platform in Mannheim. I was so relieved to see him, and he took me back to the small flat he and Jutta shared. We had a great dinner with some friends, then got on the mulled wine. Over a few drinks, a friend of Manfred's, Brigitte, offered to put Sadie and me up for the night in a small loft in her flat. We gratefully accepted and got rolling on schnapps and vodka, then headed off to Brigitte's flat. It was snowing and really cold on the way home, and I realised my coat and clothes were not really adequate for such a cold European winter. The flat, too, was really cold, and the tiny attic she showed us was only heated by a tiny paraffin heater. The attic was half a story above the first floor in a tiny flat around a cobblestone quadrant. We hunkered down the best we could, but I had troubled dreams all night. Despite my drunken state, I kept waking up, imagining rats were running over my blankets. I woke up freezing at first light and shook Sadie awake. "There were rats running over us last night, weren't there?" I asked him. "Yeah, let's get the F out of here," he said. We raced off downstairs, but the door was locked, so we headed back up to the attic, hopped out through a window, and slid off the snow-covered roof down to the cobblestones below, a long way down, but it sure felt good to escape. Turns out Brigitte had kept pet rats, but they had escaped. Then wild rats came in and bred with the pet rats, living under the floor and in the walls. What a nightmare. Nonetheless, our stay in Mannheim was wonderful. We visited one or two older folks who had lived through the war, and they came across markedly different to the younger generations. Most of our days were compiled of drinking the Germans' wonderful pills and vodka and going for long walks in the snow. It was amazing to see how thick it piled up on the trees. Christmas turned out to be a pretty tame affair, but New Year's Eve was a real blast. A few of us went round drunk as skunks, blowing out street lights with pistols which shot like starting guns. Never seen anything like it. I really liked staying with the Germans. They are an interesting and complex people, if somewhat flawed. They seem tied to their past in all of its dark and awkward ways, glorious and yet terrible. That is where the complexity comes in. It was an enlightening time. In those days, Germany was still split into East and West. A year or two later, the wall came down, and the world continued to change as it must. After New Year's, I had to head back to London. I had virtually no money left and no maps or plan of how I would get back to London. Manfred dropped me off about 20 k's out of Mannheim, and I had to hitchhike my way down through Germany, then hook right at Aachen on the border and cross through Belgium via Brussels to Ostend and back across the Channel to Dover and on to London. On the motorway it was cold, grey in the middle and white on the shoulders. There was ice under the snow on the shoulders, which made walking down the sides very slow and difficult. Vehicles were travelling fast and no trucks seemed willing to stop. In those days I was young, fit and very strong. I could easily walk 20 kilometres in a day, and I was prepared to do whatever it took to get back to London. But the more the day wore on, the more it became apparent I had bitten off more than I could chew. No matter how hard I tried, I could not get a lift, and I was forced to walk on the snow all day. By the time it got dark, the cold cut through to my bones. I knew I had to find shelter, or there was a good chance I would freeze to death in the sub-zero temperatures on the motorway. I kept driving myself on until about 8 p.m. in the dark, where I came across a petrol station on the side of the motorway that had a cafe and public toilets. It was so good to sit in the cafe, thaw my bones and sip a hot coffee. All the same, it was becoming apparent that I was underprepared for the journey home, and I needed to get out of there and across the border at Aachen as soon as possible. So after a cold night sitting in the freezing public toilets in the relatively warm cafe, I was still awake at dawn, standing on the motorway outside the petrol station thumbing for a lift. The morning passed by, then the afternoon. All the trucks seemed to be heading south to Cologne, and there weren't too many cars. I got more and more cold and tired, unable to get round to the border, and I knew that I was in trouble deep. One day turned into 2, then 3. The cafe closed about 2 a.m, so I was forced to shelter in the freezing public toilets. I couldn't sleep, and the lack of food and cold started to take a huge toll on me. On the second day of my entrapment in this place, some guy ordered some Wiener Schnitzel, took one bite, looked at me straight in the eye and left. If it wasn't for that meal he'd left behind, I probably wouldn't have survived that huge journey home. After 3 days stuck in the gas station, I knew I had to strike out or die. I walked some 30 kilometres down and round to the Aachen border. The weather warmed up enough to rain and I got saturated. Then the temperature dropped so low my clothes froze solid on my body and I thought I would freeze to death. But I drove myself on and met up with a bloke in a car at the border. He was a real nice bloke who worked for BASF in Brussels and gave me a lift from the German border to the centre of Brussels in Belgium. I slept all the way and managed to recharge the batteries and regain my resolve to get back to London, no matter what. I knew that Ostend was the closest port to Brussels, but I had no map, food or money, and no idea of which direction to go. I was still exhausted and I stumbled into the underground. I guessed which way to go despite the fact I knew no Belgian. I got to the outskirts and followed what looked like a main road until sunset. It was snowing and very cold and I was getting desperate to find respite from the freezing road. I came across an old Gothic church and pounded on its massive doors, but neither God nor his representative answered my calls, so I stumbled off down the motorway, out of Brussels. I came across a sign pointing to Gand, and guessed it must be halfway to Ostend. It was too late to turn back, so I had to risk everything and walk all night, hitchhiking in the dark and the snow. The side of the motorway was slippery with ankle-deep snow. Slowly the wind and snow exhausted me as I marched through the night. I had only eaten one meal and had a few hours sleep in 4 days. By 10 p.m. I was utterly exhausted. I had walked about 20 kilometres and could take no more. I found a bridge and crawled underneath to get out of the foul weather. I felt so tired all I could think of was curling up and going to sleep. Eerily, as I started to lose consciousness, I could hear my father's voice, urging me to keep going, not to fall asleep, there, or I would surely die. I headed back to the motorway and was so tired I was stumbling all over the place. The traffic was light, but finally a car skidded to a stop some 200 metres in front of me. I stumbled as fast as I could, and the lady driver took me some 20 kilometres down the motorway. Her car was so comfortable and warm. "Why did you stop to pick me up?" I asked her. "Because you looked like you needed help," was all she said to me. It was just enough to keep me going. Around 11 p.m, a bunch of guys picked me up. The car was full and they were pissed but full of fun. I had to lie down over their legs in the back seat with my pack over my back. Uncomfortable, but another 15 kilometres closer to Gand. After that I was utterly spent. Back out in the wind and the snow I stumbled along, slipping in and out of consciousness. Around midnight a bloke picked me up. He introduced himself as Peter and told me he was going through to Gand. He said I could stay with some friends of his who sold Persian carpets. I was too weak to argue, though I had the most horrible feeling I was about to meet a horrible end. We arrived at about 1 a.m. at a place called Room with a View, and I entered a dark shop and ascended a flight of stairs. At the top of the stairs, I entered a huge dining room. There was an extremely long table there, covered in white linen and lit with a series of candles. About 8 people were sitting around it, and I was introduced to Marty and his wife who owned the place. They invited me to sit down and gave me some steak, a joint, and half a pack of menthol cigarettes. Despite my rising fear, I indulged in the sustenance offered in this most bizarre of midnight feasts. We ate, chatted and smoked into the small hours, then Marty showed me to my room, which featured a cast-iron bath. I drew a bath and had my first soak in nearly a week, then passed out in crisp, clean linen sheets. I slept for the next 2 days and nights, slowly regained my strength. After that I spent a couple of days wandering around the beautiful medieval town that had managed to survive the blitzkrieg of the Nazis. Then it was time for me to push on to the coast. I only had £20 left, enough to pay for the ferry across the channel. I couldn't afford to pay Marty for the accommodation, but he was fine with that and dropped me off on the outskirts of town and wished me good luck. I hugged him and thanked him sincerely for being there when I needed his help so badly. Those sort of things you never forget. Within 15 minutes of being dropped off, I was picked up by John, who lived just 5 minutes' drive from Ostend. He took me back to his little flat where he lived with Susan, who was dying of cancer. Upon meeting Susan, I felt a real immediate connection. She told me she only had 2 weeks to live, and it broke my heart to hear her story as we talked long into the night. She wanted answers from me, why she was dying, what her life had really been for. I stayed with her for a few days, but I had to explain that I could not give her all the answers she needed. Leaving John and Susan to face the next few weeks was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. They dropped me off at the port, and I was lucky enough to meet up with a truck driver who gave me a free lift all the way down from Dover to London. I had only to walk 10 kilometres home to my squat, and I marched back, hardly able to believe the adventure that had just unfolded. Once again I was able to cheat death, yet I lost so much along the way. Over the next few weeks I settled back into my life in London, reflecting upon all the trials I had to face and all the wonderful people who came together to save my life. The longest march home as a winter I will never forget. The end. Well, that's me for another week. Got to wrap it up now. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Spread the good word with your friends. Tune in, and I'll be back as soon as I can. I look forward to it. Thank you to all the good people up in the lovely Hawke's Bay, to those in the Wairarapa. I wish you well. Be good, and do something nice for someone this week. That would really be a wonderful thing. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.